Be quiet. Ethan Caldwell didn't even look at him when he said it. His voice sharp and clean like the edge of a polished knife, the kind of tone that didn't ask for silence but expected it. The street around them pulsed with late afternoon traffic, engines humming, tires brushing against asphalt still warm from the fading sun, and right in the middle of it all stood Marcus Reed, hands slightly raised, eyes fixed on the underside of a sleek black sedan worth more than he had probably seen in his entire life. He smelled like rain-soaked fabric and city dust, his jacket worn thin at the elbows, his shoes split at the seams, but his gaze was steady, unshaken by the stares beginning to gather. "Sir, there's something wrong with your car," Marcus said again, quieter this time, not pleading, just certain. Ethan finally turned, irritation flickering across his face like a shadow passing over glass. To him, Marcus was just another interruption, another piece of background noise in a life engineered for precision and control. Around them, a few people slowed, watching with that familiar mix of curiosity and dismissal, someone chuckling under their breath, another whispering, "Guys just looking for money." Marcus didn't react. His focus stayed locked on the car, on something beneath it that didn't belong, something small, out of place, something his eyes, trained by years he never talked about, couldn't ignore. Ethan exhaled sharply, adjusting the cuff of his tailored sleeve, already turning back toward the open car door. "Handle it," he muttered to his security, dismissing Marcus like a smudge on glass. But Marcus didn't move. Not away. Not this time. The air seemed to tighten, like the moment before a storm breaks, the city noise dimming just enough for the sound of Marcus's breath to become real, present. He had seen things like this before. Not often, but enough. Enough to know when something wasn't just wrong, but dangerous. His fingers twitched at his sides, hesitation flickering for the briefest second. Walk away, like he always did, stay invisible, stay safe. But then it was gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. Choice. Marcus took a step forward. Instead, "You need to step back," he said, more firmly now, voice cutting through the noise just enough to make a few heads turn. Ethan didn't listen. He was already halfway into the car, one polished shoe disappearing past the doorframe, his world still perfectly intact, still untouched by the warning standing just a few feet away. And Marcus, standing there in worn clothes and steady silence, realized something simple, something that didn't need words. If he walked away now, no one else would see it. No one else would stop it. And for a man the world had spent years pretending didn't exist, that choice suddenly felt louder than anything on that street. Marcus moved before the thought could fade, his boots scraping against the pavement as he closed the distance between himself and the car, the late afternoon light catching on the polished metal like nothing in the world could ever go wrong around it. But he had seen enough broken things to know that danger never announced itself loudly. It hid in quiet places, in details people with comfort in their lives never had to notice. And now that detail was right there beneath the frame, small, unnatural, wrong. "Sir, please," Marcus said again, his voice firmer now, not louder, just anchored, like he had already made the decision and there was no turning back. Ethan paused halfway into the driver's seat, irritation tightening his jaw as he turned his head just enough to acknowledge the voice again, but not enough to truly see the man behind it. "You are done here," Ethan said flatly, his tone colder now, practiced, the kind of dismissal that ended conversations before they could begin. One of the security guards stepped forward, placing a hand out, not aggressive, but firm enough to create distance. "Move along," he said quietly. The crowd had grown thicker, drawn in by the tension that sat just beneath the surface, people pretending to check their phones while their eyes stayed fixed on the scene, the city always hungry for moments that broke routine. Marcus felt the pressure of their gaze, the familiar weight of being watched but not seen, judged but not understood, and for a split second, his body leaned back. Instinct telling him to retreat, to disappear like he always did when things became complicated. But then he looked again, under the car, that same detail, that same shape. His breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition, and suddenly the noise of the street faded into something distant, like he was standing in a different moment entirely, one that felt older than the life he was living now. His hands tightened into fists, then relaxed, then tightened again. This was the point where most people walked away. This was the point where survival meant silence. But something inside him refused. "You need to step out of the car," Marcus said. And this time there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a quiet urgency that did not match the worn state of his clothes or the way people had already decided who he was. Ethan let out a short, humorless breath, shaking his head as if he had just heard the most absurd request of the day. "I am not taking instructions from someone who does not even belong here," he replied, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel, ready to pull the door closed. The guard moved closer to Marcus now, more direct, reaching for his arm. "That is enough." But Marcus reacted faster than anyone expected, not with force, not with anger, but with clarity, stepping past the guard in one smooth motion and placing his hand flat against the car door, stopping it from closing. The contact was brief, but it shifted everything. The air changed. The murmurs in the crowd sharpened. Ethan's eyes snapped up, meeting Marcus's for the first time, really seeing him, not as a background figure, but as an interruption that would not go away. And in that brief moment, Marcus did not look like a man asking for help or money or attention. He looked like someone who knew something. "Just give me 10 seconds, Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension pressing in from every direction, "and step away from the car." The words hung there, heavier than they should have been, and for the first time since the encounter began, Ethan hesitated, not because he believed him, but because something in the certainty of that voice did not match the image he had already decided on, and that mismatch, that small crack in expectation, was enough to slow him down by just a fraction of a second. The hesitation did not last long, but it was enough, just enough for Marcus to move again, his hand sliding from the car door to the edge of the frame as he lowered himself slightly, eyes narrowing toward the shadow beneath the vehicle, the noise of the street returning in fragments, distant horns, a siren somewhere blocks away, the low murmur of people trying to understand what they were witnessing. But Marcus was no longer listening to any of it. His focus locked onto that one detail that refused to belong, a small device no bigger than a paperback book, tucked too neatly against the undercarriage, wires barely visible unless you knew where to look, and Marcus knew exactly where to look. Ethan watched him now, fully, his posture no longer casual, one foot still inside the car, the other on the pavement, caught between leaving and staying, control and uncertainty, his fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the door as the seconds stretched longer than they should have. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice lower now, less dismissive, more cautious, as if something in the moment had shifted beyond his usual reach. Marcus did not answer immediately, his breath steady as he leaned in just enough to confirm what his instincts had already told him, and when he straightened, there was no doubt left in his expression, no hesitation to soften what came next. "That should not be there," Marcus said, his voice quiet but precise, every word placed carefully, like he understood the weight they carried. The guard stepped forward again, more tense this time, his gaze darting between Marcus and the underside of the car, uncertainty creeping into a situation that had seemed simple just moments ago. "Step back," the guard said, but the command lacked the same confidence it had before. Marcus raised his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in clarity, giving them space while still holding the moment together. "I am stepping back," he replied, "but you need to listen now." The crowd shifted, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by something quieter, something tighter, like a string pulled just a little too far. Ethan exhaled slowly, stepping fully out of the car now, the door left open behind him, the engine still humming softly, a detail that suddenly felt too loud in the silence that followed. "Explain," Ethan said, his eyes fixed on Marcus, no longer seeing him as background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. Marcus glanced once more at the car, then back at Ethan, measuring his words, not for effect, but for truth. "I used to work on cars," he said, the sentence simple, almost understated, but carrying a past he did not elaborate on. "And nothing under there belongs to the way this model is built." Ethan's brow tightened, the first visible crack in his composure. Not panic, not yet, but recognition that something was not aligning with the controlled structure of his world. "Are you saying this is some kind of malfunction?" he asked, searching for a logical explanation. Something contained, something manageable. Marcus shook his head once, slow, deliberate. No, he said, and the word landed heavier than anything else he had spoken so far. I am saying someone put it there. The air changed again, deeper this time, the kind of shift that did not just affect a moment, but everything that came after it. And for the first time since he stepped onto the street, Ethan Caldwell did not have an immediate answer. Only the quiet realization that the man he had nearly ignored might be the only reason he was standing there at all. The words settled into the space between them like a weight no one could easily move. And for a moment the entire street seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the engine now too loud, too present, like a reminder that something was still running beneath the surface, unseen but very real. Ethan's gaze dropped slowly toward the car, his mind working through possibilities, searching for something that made sense within the rules he trusted, but the certainty in Marcus's voice did not fit into any of them. Step away from the vehicle, Ethan said suddenly, his tone sharper now, directed not at Marcus, but at his own security team, and this time there was no hesitation in the response. The guard nodded, moving quickly to create distance, his earlier confidence replaced by focused urgency, as he signaled for backup through a small device clipped to his collar. The crowd shifted again, people taking a few careful steps back, instinct guiding them even before understanding caught up, the invisible boundary around the car widening with each passing second. Marcus stayed where he was, a few feet away, hands lowered now, his posture calm but alert, as if he had already stepped out of the moment while everyone else was just beginning to enter it. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with steady fingers, but there was a subtle tension in the way he held it, a slight delay before he spoke, as if the act of calling for help was an admission that something had slipped beyond his control. I need a unit here, he said into the phone, his voice controlled but firm. Possible tampering with a vehicle, downtown, 5th and Mercer. He paused, listening, his eyes flicking briefly toward Marcus again, reassessing, recalculating. Yes, immediately. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, exhaling slowly as he stepped another pace back from the car, putting physical distance between himself and the unknown. The engine continued to idle, a low, steady vibration that seemed to echo through the pavement, through the soles of their shoes, through the silence that had replaced the earlier noise. Marcus watched the car without blinking, his eyes tracing the lines of it, the way the sunlight reflected off the surface, the way everything looked perfectly normal from a distance. And that was what made it dangerous. Things that looked normal were the easiest to trust. And trust, he had learned, was where mistakes began. Ethan followed his gaze, studying the vehicle now as if seeing it for the first time, not as a symbol of success or control, but as an object that could be altered, interfered with, turned into something unpredictable. How did you even notice it? Ethan asked after a moment, his voice quieter now, less defensive, more searching. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the question pulling him back from his focus just enough to answer. The way the suspension sat, he said, nodding subtly toward the rear axle. It was off by maybe half an inch. Most people would not see it, but it changes the balance. He paused, then added, and there was a reflection where there should not have been one. Ethan glanced again, trying to see what Marcus had seen, but the details refused to reveal themselves easily, hidden behind years of not needing to look that closely. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to grow, low at first, then gradually clearer, threading its way through the city noise like a signal that something real was unfolding. Marcus heard it too, but his expression did not change. He had done what he needed to do. Whatever came next was not his world. He took a small step back, then another, creating space, preparing to disappear the same way he had always done, quietly, without recognition, without expectation. Ethan noticed the movement immediately. Wait, he said, the word leaving his mouth before he fully considered it, a reflex more than a decision, and Marcus paused just long enough to turn his head slightly, not fully facing him, but enough to acknowledge that he had heard. For a second, neither of them spoke, the distance between them filled with everything that had just shifted, everything that could not be undone. And in that silence, Ethan realized something he had not expected to feel. He did not want this man to walk away unnoticed. Marcus did not turn fully, but he did not walk away either, his shoulders still angled toward the street, toward the exit that had always been his safest direction, while Ethan stood there, caught between the instinct to regain control and the unfamiliar weight of needing something from someone he had already dismissed. The sirens were closer now, louder, cutting through the air in sharp pulses that made the moment feel smaller, tighter, like time itself was narrowing around them. "What is your name?" Ethan asked, his voice steadier than he felt, the question simple but carrying a shift that neither of them could ignore. Marcus hesitated, just for a second, as if the answer mattered more than it should. Then he spoke without turning. "Marcus. No last name. No explanation. Just enough to exist." Ethan nodded slowly, the name settling into his mind, anchoring the moment in something real. "Marcus," he repeated, quieter, as if testing it, making sure it stayed. Behind them, the first emergency vehicle pulled up, lights flashing across the polished surface of the car, red and blue reflections bending over metal that now felt less like an asset and more like a question waiting to be answered. Uniformed officers stepped out quickly but calmly, their movements practiced, controlled, guided by protocol rather than panic. One of them approached Ethan directly. "Sir, we are going to need everyone to keep a safe distance," he said, his tone respectful but firm. Ethan nodded, stepping back another few feet, his eyes flicking once more toward Marcus, who had already begun to drift further away, blending into the edge of the crowd without effort, like he had done it 1,000 times before. "He is the one who saw it," Ethan said, gesturing slightly in Marcus's direction, the words leaving his mouth without hesitation now, a quiet acknowledgement that shifted the attention of the officer immediately. The officer turned, scanning the crowd, but Marcus had already moved, not running, not rushing, just walking with the same steady pace he always used when leaving a place that was never meant to hold him. For a moment, it looked like he might disappear completely, swallowed by the movement of people and noise, but then he paused again, just at the edge, as if something unfinished still lingered. He glanced back, not at Ethan, but at the car, at the situation now surrounded by uniforms and flashing lights, and his expression softened in a way that did not match the tension of the scene. It was not relief. It was something quieter, something like closure. Ethan saw that look, even from a distance, and it unsettled him more than anything else that had happened so far. It was the look of someone who had already let go of the outcome, someone who had done what needed to be done and expected nothing in return. The officers began their work, carefully inspecting the underside of the vehicle, speaking in low, precise tones, confirming what Marcus had already known within seconds of seeing it. Ethan could hear fragments of their conversation, words like device, placement, intentional, each one tightening the reality of what had nearly happened. He stood there, surrounded by professionals handling the situation, but his attention kept drifting back to the space where Marcus had been standing just moments ago. And now it was empty, completely empty. The city had already moved on, swallowing him without a trace. Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest tightening with a realization that arrived too late to act on. He had spent years building systems to track, measure, and control everything that mattered in his world. And yet, the one person who had just saved his life had walked away, without leaving anything behind except a name that already felt like it might disappear if he did not hold on to it tightly enough. Marcus. The sirens continued to echo, the lights continued to flash. But for Ethan, the moment had shifted into something else entirely, something quieter, heavier, and far more difficult to ignore than the danger that had just passed. The flashing lights painted the street in restless colors, red bleeding into blue, reflecting off glass windows and polished metal. But Ethan Caldwell barely noticed any of it anymore, his attention fixed on the empty space where Marcus had been standing, the absence louder than the sirens now fading into the background. An officer's voice pulled him back. "Sir, we are going to need a statement," the man said, holding a small notepad, his tone calm, procedural, like this was just another incident in a long line of controlled situations. Ethan nodded, but his eyes still scanned the edges of the crowd, searching for a worn jacket, a familiar silhouette, anything that might anchor the moment before it disappeared completely. He saw it first, Ethan said, his voice quieter now, less certain, as if saying it out loud might bring Marcus back into focus. "The man who was just here." The officer followed his gaze, then shook his head slightly. There is no one matching that description nearby anymore. The words landed with a finality Ethan was not prepared for. Gone. Just like that. No trace. No record. Only memory. Ethan inhaled slowly, the air cooler now as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching longer across the pavement, and for the first time that day, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something that did not come with a solution or a strategy. It felt like loss, not of something he owned, but of something he never thought to hold on to. Behind him, the technicians worked carefully, their movements precise as they examined the underside of the vehicle, confirming each detail with quiet efficiency. It was placed deliberately, one of them said, his voice low but clear enough to reach Ethan. Not random. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, letting that reality settle fully. This had not been an accident. It had been intention, and the only person who had seen it in time had walked away without asking for anything, without waiting to be acknowledged. Ethan opened his eyes again, sharper now, more focused, the part of him that built companies and solved problems beginning to reassemble itself. But this time, it was directed toward something different. Check the cameras, he said to his head of security, who had just arrived, slightly out of breath but composed. Every angle from the last hour. I want to know where he came from and where he went. The man nodded immediately, already reaching for his phone. Yes, sir. Ethan turned once more toward the street, the movement of people now returning to normal, conversations picking back up, the city resuming its rhythm as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But Ethan knew better. Something had shifted, not just in the situation, but in him. His gaze dropped briefly to the pavement where Marcus had stood, and he noticed something small, almost invisible among the dust and faint tire marks. A piece of metal, thin, slightly bent. He stepped closer, crouching just enough to pick it up between his fingers. It was light, worn, with a faint engraving barely visible along the edge, something that looked like part of a tool, something used, not decorative. He turned it slightly in the fading light, and for a moment, he could almost see Marcus holding it, working with it, understanding things most people overlooked. Ethan straightened slowly, the small object still in his hand, his grip tightening just a little. This was not just evidence. It was a connection, the only one he had. The sirens had quieted now, replaced by the low murmur of the city settling back into place. But Ethan stood there, still, holding that piece of metal like it mattered more than anything else in that moment. Because it did. And somewhere out there, the man who had left it behind was already disappearing into a world Ethan had never had to understand. Not until now. The night had fully settled over the city now, swallowing the last traces of daylight as Ethan Caldwell stood alone near the edge of the street, the noise of emergency crews fading into a distant rhythm that no longer felt important compared to the weight forming quietly in his mind. The small piece of metal he held earlier was now back in his palm, turned over slowly between his fingers as if it might reveal something new if he looked at it long enough. But all it offered was silence, the kind that refused to give answers. Behind him, the scene had already begun to dissolve into procedure, officers finishing their notes, vehicles preparing to leave, the moment transforming from crisis into record in a way that felt almost too efficient for something that had nearly changed everything. Ethan did not leave. He stayed where Marcus had been standing, as if remaining there might somehow bridge the distance that had already grown between them. His security had approached carefully, tablet in hand. We have camera access from the intersection and surrounding buildings, the man said. We are processing it now. Ethan nodded once, but his attention did not shift. Find him, he said simply, not as an order this time, but as something closer to necessity. The security head paused slightly at the tone, then nodded again and stepped away. The streetlights flickered on fully, washing the pavement in a steady glow that erased the last warmth of the sun. Ethan finally looked up, scanning the flow of people again, hoping for something impossible, a familiar silhouette among strangers. But there was nothing. Marcus had already been absorbed by the city, just another presence that existed briefly and then stopped being visible to those who were not looking closely enough. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that felt heavier than it should have, and for the first time, he realized how often his life had depended on people he never noticed. A woman passing nearby slowed slightly, glancing at him before continuing on, and that small moment reminded him that the world had been moving around him the entire time without waiting for his awareness. He looked down again at the metal fragment in his hand. It was small, ordinary to anyone else, but now it felt like the only proof that what had just happened was real. Not a mistake, not imagination, something precise, something intentional. His phone vibrated again, pulling him briefly back into motion. A message from his head of security appeared on the screen, reviewing footage. Subject identified entering street from Northside Alley approximately 8 minutes before incident. Ethan stared at the message, his grip tightening slightly. 8 minutes. That meant Marcus had not been randomly present. He had arrived with purpose, seen something others had missed, and acted without hesitation. Ethan looked up once more at the empty stretch of pavement where everything had begun, and now it no longer felt like an accident that Marcus had been there. It felt like direction. The realization settled in slowly, changing the shape of his thoughts, making everything he had assumed earlier feel incomplete. Around him, the city continued without pause. Cars passing, voices overlapping, lights shifting, but Ethan remained still, holding on to the only fragment of connection he had left, knowing that somewhere beyond this moment, a man named Marcus had already returned to a world that did not wait for recognition. Hours later, the city had fully moved on, as if nothing beneath its surface had ever shifted, but inside a quiet control room 2 floors above Ethan Caldwell's corporate office, the world looked very different, screens glowing in low light as technicians rewound footage frame by frame, searching for something that most people would have never noticed in the first place. Ethan stood behind them, arms crossed, his posture controlled but no longer relaxed, his attention locked onto the largest monitor where the street intersection replayed in silent loops. There it was again. Marcus, walking into frame from the north alley exactly as the report had stated. No hesitation, no wandering, direct movement, as if he already knew what he was looking for before he arrived. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Pause it there, he said, and the technician obeyed immediately. The image froze. Marcus was mid-step, head slightly tilted, eyes already scanning beneath the vehicle even before anyone else had reacted. Ethan studied the frame closely, something tightening in his expression. Zoom in on his hands, he added. The technician complied, enlarging the image until the details became visible. Marcus's hands were empty, but his posture told a different story, not of confusion or chance, but of intent shaped by experience. Ethan exhaled slowly, his thoughts shifting again, reorganizing around a reality that refused to stay simple. He was not guessing. Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The room stayed silent. Another screen replayed a different angle, showing Marcus stepping closer to the vehicle, then stopping, focusing, noticing something invisible to everyone else passing by. Ethan watched without blinking. There was no hesitation in Marcus, no scanning for validation, no looking around for permission. Just observation, decision, action. A technician spoke carefully from the side. We tracked his movement pattern before arrival. He was approximately 3 blocks away at a bus stop for over 40 minutes before walking directly here. Ethan nodded once, absorbing the information, but his focus did not shift away from the screen. 40 minutes. That meant he had been waiting, watching, or thinking. The idea that Marcus had simply stumbled into the moment no longer held any weight. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor, lowering his voice slightly. Enhance. Audio from the street mic. The technician activated the recording. At first, it was just ambient noise, traffic, distant conversations, wind against glass. Then faint fragments of voices appeared, including Ethan's own earlier command, the dismissal, the refusal to listen. Ethan's jaw tightened as he heard himself, but he did not ask to stop it. Instead, he listened. Then came Marcus's voice, clearer now, in replay. Calm, direct, certain. The same tone that had cut through everything else that day. Ethan leaned back slightly, processing it all again, but differently this time, no longer as participant, but as observer of his own mistake. The room remained still, no one speaking, waiting for instruction. Finally, Ethan straightened. Pull everything, he said. Every camera within a 5-block radius. Every pedestrian angle. Every reflection. He paused briefly, eyes still on the frozen frame of Marcus walking away. I want to know how someone like that stays invisible in a city like this. No one answered immediately, but the urgency in his voice made it clear this was no longer about procedure. It was about understanding something he had completely missed. As the technicians began working again, Ethan remained standing behind them, watching Marcus appear and disappear across multiple screens, each angle reinforcing the same truth. The man had not been random. He had been precise. And for the first time since the incident, Ethan realized the most important part was not what Marcus had seen under the car. It was how long Marcus had been seeing things like that before anyone ever thought to look at him. In the early hours of the morning, when the city outside the glass walls of Ethan Caldwell's office was still quiet and half asleep, the control room remained active, filled with the low hum of monitors and the soft clicking of keyboards as technicians continued reviewing every angle of footage they could retrieve. But the focus of the room had shifted, no longer about what had happened, but about the man who had caused it without asking for recognition. Ethan stood near the center screen, arms no longer crossed, his posture looser, but his attention sharper than before, as if the absence of answers had forced him into a different kind of thinking. On the largest display, Marcus appeared again, this time at a different angle from a building camera across the street, walking away after the moment had passed, blending into pedestrian traffic with the same quiet consistency as everyone else, yet somehow still separate from it. We have traced additional movement, one technician said, pulling up another sequence. He entered a transit station approximately 20 minutes after leaving the intersection. Ethan nodded slowly, watching as the footage shifted to show Marcus descending into the subway entrance, pausing briefly at the top of the stairs as if checking something unseen before continuing down. There was nothing dramatic in the movement, no urgency, no hesitation, only direction, and that made it more difficult to ignore. Has anyone identified his background yet? Ethan asked without looking away from the screen. A brief silence followed before another technician responded carefully. No official records in the system under Marcus Reed matching employment history or residential address within the last 5 years. It is as if he is not registered in any formal capacity. Ethan finally turned slightly, absorbing that information. Not registered, not tracked, not visible in the systems that normally defined a person's presence in a city like this. Yet he had seen what Marcus saw before anyone else did. The contradiction settled heavily in Ethan's thoughts, refusing to align with the assumptions he had built his entire life around. He stepped closer to the workstation, placing a hand lightly on the edge of the desk. "Pull public transit footage," he said. "I want every stop he passed through." The technician nodded and began switching feeds. As the screens updated, Marcus appeared again, standing among strangers on a subway platform, head slightly lowered, posture calm, blending into the environment in a way that made him nearly unnoticeable unless someone was specifically looking for him. Ethan watched carefully now, not with the urgency of earlier hours, but with something closer to study. There was no performance in Marcus's behavior, no attempt to stand out or disappear intentionally. He simply existed within spaces most people overlooked. The train arrived, doors opening with a mechanical sound that echoed through the platform. Marcus stepped inside with the flow of passengers, taking a position near the edge of the car, one hand resting lightly on the vertical pole. The footage continued, showing him looking out through the window as the train began to move, city lights passing in streaks behind him. Ethan felt a shift in understanding that was difficult to name. Marcus had not been part of Ethan's world before that moment on the street, yet he had seen more in seconds than Ethan's trained systems had detected in hours. "Keep tracking him," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. "I need to know where he goes next." The technician confirmed the order, but Ethan remained still, eyes fixed on the moving train on screen, as if distance itself had become irrelevant. Somewhere beneath the structure of the city, Marcus was still moving forward without recognition, without awareness of the attention now directed toward him. And for the first time, Ethan understood that finding Marcus again might not be as simple as following data or tracking patterns, because some people did not stay in the places where systems expected them to be. The subway footage continued to loop across the screens in the control room, but the energy inside the space had shifted again, becoming quieter, more focused, as Ethan Caldwell stood motionless behind the technicians, watching Marcus Reed move through the underground system with the same calm precision he had shown on the street earlier that day. Each frame revealed a pattern that Ethan could no longer ignore. Marcus was not wandering. He was navigating, not reacting to the city, but reading it. The train doors opened at another station, and Marcus stepped out with the same steady pace, blending into the flow of commuters without hesitation. He exits at Eastborough Station, a technician said, marking the timestamp. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the movement on multiple screens at once. "Zoom that angle," he said, pointing toward a camera positioned near the station exit. The image sharpened. Marcus paused briefly at the top of the stairs, scanning the street above before continuing forward. It was a small moment, almost invisible unless watched closely, but Ethan saw it clearly now. It was not hesitation. It was assessment, the kind of behavior that came from someone who understood environments before entering them. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "He is checking sight lines before he moves," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. A technician glanced at him. "Sir." Ethan straightened. "He is not just walking through the city," he clarified. "He is evaluating it." The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of that observation settling in. On another screen, Marcus appeared again, now above ground, moving through a quieter residential street, the early morning light beginning to soften the edges of buildings and sidewalks. There was no urgency in his movement, no sense of being followed or leading anywhere specific, yet every step carried intention. Ethan studied the footage carefully, replaying sections where Marcus had interacted with his surroundings, noting how often his attention shifted toward small details most people would overlook entirely. A loose panel on a utility box, the reflection in a storefront window, the angle of traffic flow at intersections. "He is not random," Ethan said again, this time more firmly. The technician working the playback system adjusted the timeline, showing a continuous path from the station exit forward. "We have him moving toward the River District," the technician reported. Ethan's expression changed slightly at that. The River District was older, less structured, a place where the city's systems were less consistent, where data coverage was incomplete in certain zones. He watched as Marcus entered that area, disappearing briefly between buildings where camera coverage became fragmented. "Increase coverage overlap," Ethan instructed immediately. "I want every angle we have." The screens shifted again, piecing together fragmented views of Marcus moving through narrow streets, passing storefronts that had not been updated in years, crossing intersections where traffic cameras struggled to maintain full visibility. Despite the gaps, Marcus remained traceable, not because he was easy to follow, but because he moved in ways that left patterns behind. Ethan stepped closer to the central monitor, his focus narrowing further. There was something about the consistency in Marcus's behavior that no longer felt like chance. It felt practiced, learned. "Has there been any alert from law enforcement systems?" Ethan asked. The technician shook his head. "No alerts. No flags. Nothing in active databases." Ethan exhaled slowly, processing that absence. If Marcus had a history in systems like this, it was not visible through standard channels. And yet, his awareness suggested experience that could not be explained by randomness alone. On screen, Marcus stopped briefly near a corner store, glancing across the street before continuing forward. The movement was subtle, but Ethan noticed it immediately. He was mapping something, not just walking through space, but understanding it in layers. Ethan's phone vibrated again, but he did not look at it. His attention stayed fixed on the screen as Marcus continued deeper into the River District, becoming harder to track as camera density decreased. The technician spoke carefully. "We may lose visual continuity in the next few blocks." Ethan nodded once, still watching. "Keep what you have," he said. "Even gaps matter." As the footage continued, Marcus reached a point where cameras no longer overlapped, and his image flickered between visible and absent across different feeds. For a moment, it felt as if he had stepped outside the system entirely, leaving only fragments behind for others to interpret. Ethan stood still, staring at the last visible frame of Marcus before he disappeared again into an area the city did not fully capture. And in that silence, Ethan realized something that made the entire pursuit feel different from anything he had done before. Marcus was not simply moving through the city. He was moving through its blind spots. The river district appeared on screen as a fragmented map of partial visibility, broken camera feeds stitched together by system overlays. And Ethan Caldwell stood in the control room with an intensity that had not eased since Marcus Reed vanished from the monitored grid, his eyes moving between shifting angles that no longer provided a continuous picture, but instead offered only pieces, gaps, and uncertainty. "We have partial tracking from Building 7 to the East Corridor," a technician reported, adjusting playback speed as the footage attempted to reconstruct Marcus's path through areas where surveillance density dropped significantly. Ethan did not blink. "Continue forward frame by frame," he said, his voice steady but sharpened by focus. The screen showed Marcus emerging briefly into view between two older brick buildings, then disappearing again as he crossed into a section where cameras failed to overlap. Each reappearance was brief, almost like a pulse in the system, never long enough to fully capture detail, but consistent enough to confirm movement. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the monitor. "He is deliberately moving through low-coverage zones," he said quietly, more observation than question. The technician glanced up. "You mean he is avoiding surveillance?" Ethan paused, then corrected without hesitation. "Not avoiding. Navigating." The room went still for a moment. On another screen, a different angle showed Marcus pausing near a side street, looking upward toward a corner camera before stepping out of its field of view. It was not avoidance driven by fear. It was awareness of structure. Ethan straightened slowly. "He understands where he can and cannot be seen," he said. Another technician switched feeds, revealing Marcus moving along a narrow walkway behind older commercial buildings, his pace unchanged, his posture calm, as if the lack of visibility did not affect his direction. Ethan watched carefully, his earlier assumptions continuing to break apart piece by piece. This was not a man who relied on chance or instinct alone. There was calculation behind every movement, but not in a way that matched corporate strategy or trained security behavior. It was something different, something built from lived experience rather than instruction. "We are losing him again." In this segment, the technician said, pointing at a feed that flickered between static and partial image. Ethan nodded once. "Stabilize alternate angles," he ordered. "Use reflective surfaces if necessary." The team adjusted quickly, pulling in secondary feeds from storefront windows and traffic mirrors, reconstructing Marcus's path through indirect visuals. The image reformed just enough to show him crossing another intersection, briefly visible in the reflection of a glass storefront before disappearing again beyond the edge of frame. Ethan exhaled slowly, absorbing the pattern. Marcus was not simply avoiding detection. He was moving in a way that treated the environment as a system of layers, using each layer depending on its visibility and reliability. It was deliberate, controlled, and adaptive in a way that felt deeply practiced. "He is reading the city differently," Ethan said, almost to himself. A technician responded cautiously. "Sir." Ethan kept his eyes on the screen. "Most people move through space assuming visibility is constant," he said. "He does not." The feeds continued to cycle, showing fragments of Marcus's movement deeper into the district, where surveillance became increasingly inconsistent. Ethan noticed something else now. Every time Marcus entered a blind zone, he reappeared not randomly, but at points that aligned with predictable structural gaps, places where systems naturally failed. Alley intersections, construction shadows, older infrastructure corners. Ethan stepped back slightly from the monitor, his mind assembling the pattern as the data continued to confirm it. Marcus was not just surviving within the city. He understood its weaknesses, and more importantly, he moved through them without hesitation. The control room remained silent except for the steady hum of equipment and the occasional click of frame advancement. Ethan's phone vibrated once more, but he ignored it again. His attention was fully anchored to the unfolding pattern on screen, where Marcus Reed continued to move through spaces most systems failed to fully capture. And in that realization, Ethan understood something that shifted the entire meaning of the search itself. Marcus was not lost in the city. He was using it. The control room had grown quieter, not from resolution but from concentration, as every available screen continued to reconstruct fragmented movement through the river district, and Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it all with a focus that no longer felt like command, but something closer to necessity. The pattern of Marcus Reed's movement was now clearer than before, not because the city had revealed him, but because he had revealed how the city failed to see. "We have a partial convergence at grid intersection 12, a technician said, adjusting overlays that attempted to merge multiple camera angles into a continuous path. Ethan did not take his eyes off the screen. "Show me the overlap," he said immediately. The display shifted, combining reflections from a storefront window, a traffic mirror, and a high-mounted security camera across the street. For a brief moment, Marcus appeared fully visible again, walking at a steady pace through a narrow corridor between older buildings, his direction unchanged despite the increasing fragmentation of the feed around him. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "He is maintaining trajectory even without direct visual confirmation," he said quietly, as if confirming a theory that had already begun forming in his mind. The technician beside him nodded. "Yes, sir. It appears he is using consistent environmental markers." Ethan's expression tightened slightly at that phrase. Environmental markers. It was not random movement. It was structured awareness. On screen, Marcus slowed briefly at a corner where the street widened, his head turning slightly as if measuring distance or observing angles that were not immediately obvious to the cameras tracking him. Then he continued forward without hesitation. Ethan's gaze followed every step. There was something increasingly difficult to ignore. Marcus was not reacting to surveillance. He was moving as if surveillance itself was only one layer of many, not the dominant one. "Increase resolution on reflection feed," Ethan said. The technician complied, and the image sharpened just enough to show Marcus passing a glass storefront, his reflection briefly aligning with his physical movement before both disappeared as he moved beyond the frame. Ethan straightened slowly. "He is not just avoiding detection zones," he said. "He is anticipating them." The room remained silent for a moment, the implication settling in. Another feed activated, showing Marcus crossing a pedestrian bridge that spanned a lower roadway. The angle was high and unstable, but enough to confirm continuity of movement. He did not slow. He did not hesitate. Each step carried the same measured consistency that Ethan had first seen on the street, but now it was reinforced by repetition across multiple environments. Ethan placed both hands lightly on the edge of the console in front of him. "How many blind zones has he passed through since leaving Eastborough Station?" he asked. The technician quickly reviewed logs. At least 7 confirmed gaps in coverage. Possibly more unrecorded transitions between overlapping systems. Ethan nodded once. 7 confirmed gaps. And yet Marcus had remained traceable through indirect means. That fact alone changed the nature of what they were observing. It was no longer about tracking a man. It was about understanding how he moved through spaces designed to obscure visibility. Ethan's phone vibrated again, but he still did not check it. His focus remained on the shifting images, where Marcus continued to move deeper into the city's older infrastructure, areas where modern systems were layered over incomplete foundations. On screen, Marcus paused once more, briefly, at the entrance of a narrow passage between buildings, his head tilting slightly upward as if reading something unseen before stepping forward into the gap. The camera lost him again immediately. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching the last visible frame fade into static. "He is not lost in the system," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. "He is moving through its weaknesses." The technicians continued working, adjusting feeds, searching for reappearance points, but Ethan no longer needed constant visual confirmation. The pattern had already formed in his mind. Marcus Reed was not simply a man moving through a city. He was a man who understood how cities failed to see themselves. And that realization shifted everything Ethan thought he knew about what he had been chasing. The final feed stabilized on the central monitor, not because the city had become clearer, but because Ethan Caldwell had finally learned how to read its imperfections. And in that controlled silence of the operations room, every technician waited for his reaction as the last known segment of Marcus Reed's movement replayed on screen. The footage showed a narrow service corridor between 2 aging brick buildings in the River District, a space too tight for vehicles, too overlooked for regular monitoring. And yet Marcus moved through it without hesitation, his steps steady, his posture unchanged, as if he had already mapped every possible outcome long before arriving. Ethan did not speak immediately. His eyes tracked the screen as Marcus crossed the midpoint of the corridor, briefly pausing where light from a broken overhead fixture spilled unevenly onto the ground. Then Marcus continued forward, disappearing once again into a section where no cameras existed, leaving only residual motion data and reflections from a distant window that flickered and then stabilized. "That is the last confirmed visual point," a technician said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the significance of what they were watching. Ethan nodded slowly, his attention still fixed on the screen even after Marcus had already vanished from direct view. "Show me the surrounding architecture," he said. The display shifted, overlaying structural maps of the area, highlighting blind zones, camera angles, and coverage gaps. Ethan studied it carefully, his expression no longer focused on pursuit, but on understanding. "He did not disappear," Ethan said after a moment. "He transitioned through structural absence." The technician glanced at him, uncertain. "Structural absence?" Ethan straightened slightly. "Places the system does not consider important enough to fully observe." The room remained silent again, the weight of that interpretation spreading quietly through the team. Ethan stepped closer to the map, tracing a path with his eyes that Marcus had taken, noting how each movement aligned with predictable gaps in infrastructure design. "He is not avoiding surveillance," Ethan continued. "He is using the assumptions behind it." A second technician spoke cautiously. "Sir, should we expand search parameters further into adjacent districts?" Ethan paused before answering, his gaze still locked on the map. "No," he said finally. "Not yet." The word carried more than instruction. It carried restraint. On the main screen, playback continued looping fragments of Marcus's last visible movements, but Ethan no longer needed the full image to understand the pattern. The city had not lost Marcus Reed. It had simply never accounted for someone like him. Ethan stepped back from the console slowly, his thoughts no longer centered on tracking, but on recognition. Every system he relied on assumed visibility as a constant. But Marcus had demonstrated something different. Visibility was conditional. Presence was selective. And most importantly, understanding could exist without acknowledgement. A notification appeared on Ethan's phone, but this time he looked at it immediately. It was a compiled report from Security Analysis, listing confirmed observations, movement traces, and inferred behavioral patterns. At the bottom of the report was a single line of analyst commentary. "Subject demonstrates high-level environmental literacy consistent with advanced field training or prolonged adaptive survival experience." Ethan read the line twice, then lowered the phone. "Stop treating him like a missing person," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The technicians turned slightly toward him, waiting. Ethan's eyes returned to the empty corridor on screen, now frozen in the final frame where Marcus had disappeared into structural blind space. "He is not lost," Ethan continued. "He is operating within systems that were never designed to register him." The room stayed still. No one responded immediately, because there was nothing procedural left to say that fully matched what they had just observed. Ethan exhaled slowly, the first real release of tension since the incident began. Somewhere beyond their reach, beyond their systems, beyond their assumptions, Marcus Reed had continued forward without needing permission, visibility, or recognition. And for the first time since that day began, Ethan understood that finding him again would not be about tracking movement. It would be about understanding the world from a perspective his own systems had never been built to see.